What's up, everyone? This is Steve Scully. I'm doing a reaction to a talk given by Kenneth Stanley called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, the Myth of the Objective. All right. I don't know anything about this, so it sounds interesting, so I thought I'd record myself watching it, and here we go. Probably speed this up.
Hey, thank you. Just small corrections. I'm actually computer science, not EE, so I don't actually know about EE, but I'm from the department.
Before we get going, let's just check it out. University of Central Florida, that's cool. AI, machine learning, neural networks, evolutionary computation, evolutionary complexity research group at UCF. Associate professor, Department of EECS. So let's see what that is.
Department of EECS, so it's just a little confusing. What I'm about to tell you today is from this book. It's based on this book, which is out now, called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. I'm a computer scientist, and I study artificial intelligence and machine learning. So you'll see a connection there. So here's just a general summary of what I'm going to be talking about. We were researching artificial intelligence. That's basically what I usually do. But this sentence sounds really strange, but this is true. We ran into a problem with objectives. It's a very general statement. But indeed, we saw a flaw with this very general thing that everybody does, which is setting objectives. And therefore, the consequences of this discovery, which I'm going to show you, they extended way beyond just artificial intelligence to things like creativity, innovation, and collaboration. Let me give you the short summary, but obviously there's a lot of subtleties here. Setting an objective can block its own achievement. But furthermore, it can be an obstacle to creativity and innovation in general, even if you don't have any particular destination in mind. And this goes furthermore, it tells us that without protection of individual autonomy, collaboration can become dangerously objective. And I'm going to show you that as well. The reason that this is really relevant and that we decided to write a book is because so much of our society is driven by objectives. The gatekeepers are asking for objectives to justify almost any endeavor, including a lot of people here. And if there is some kind of flaw with objective thinking, then this should be really concerning to us, especially as it relates to creative and innovative endeavors. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with the artificial intelligence, and then I'm going to segue into the broad implications. So now this is going to seem like I'm going way off on another tangent. But if you just bear with me, you'll see how this connects in. And in fact, this was as surprising to me as it is to you that this has anything to do with a general statement about setting objectives. Because when we first launched this experiment called PickBreeder, we weren't trying to make any statements about setting objectives. This was an experiment with an entirely different motivation. But what we learned from it was really deep and really interesting and unexpected. So it's kind of serendipitous. So if you just bear with me, I'll kind of give you the sense of what this experiment was about and how it led to this realization. We put this website on the internet called PickBreeder to allow people to, no surprise, breed pictures. And that really just means like the way you might breed, horses or breed dogs. Like you have a population and you're breeding them. So like if you went to PickBreeder and you told it you want to start from scratch, you'd see an interface like the one you see in front of you right now. There's 15 images in front of you, and each one of those can be thought of as an individual in a population, like one of your horses. And I can breed them just like I might breed animals, but I'll just have a single parent just for simplicity in the example. So like I might say, well, this one of the 15 is kind of interesting. Let's see what happens if it has children. Okay, so there it's children. And one of its children looks particularly different, so let's choose that one and say, okay, what if it has children, and so on. Now, if you think about this very simple toy, and sometimes things like this are called evolutionary art, where do you think this could go? It's kind of interesting to speculate. What do you think people would find? Like, say you did several dozen generations of this. You'd get tired pretty quickly. But what kind of things do you think you could find? And the answer, we didn't know for sure what would happen. But what we did think would be interesting would be to unleash hundreds of people around the world into the search space and see what happens. And the answer was really astonishing, actually, for us. It's not really what you might expect. And I'll give you a little sampling of the kind of things that people found. And this was a big surprise. First I should emphasize that this is not the work of artists. This is not retouched in any way. This is the result of breeding blobs, and this is some of the things that the users were able to find. You can see some remarkable resemblance to kind of everyday things, like there's a skull and a butterfly, and this seems to be Jupiter with its red spot there. And so actually, the story of why and how this became possible is really interesting in its own right.
Sorry.
And that's what I'm going to get into a little bit. But
That's
before I do that, I just want to give you one
fucking nuts.
other little technical bit that's going on under the hood so you can really understand and appreciate how interesting the story ultimately is. And that is that there's one thing that you can do that I didn't mention yet, which is called branching. And what's going on is that if I was playing this game and I found something that I liked, I'm allowed to press a publish button, and that publish button will send it back to the website for PickBreeder, and then it goes into the PickBreeder database, and now anybody who ever visits again can see what I discovered. And what they're allowed to do is called branch, which means they can take the thing that I personally bred, and then they can decide to breed it further. So in some way, this is like kind of standing on the shoulders of your predecessors, so extending on their invention. And so, like, for example, this face was on PickBreeder. Somebody published it. And I could come in and say I want to branch from it. And then what would happen is I get an interface that looks like this. And it becomes apparent, and there's just the usual game can be played. So now I can say, okay, I'm going to, let's say I like this one. I don't know, it has a big mouth, so we'll make it apparent. And then we can keep on iterating like that as before. And then I could publish when I find something interesting. And that'll go back to the site. So the effect of this is that what's going on under the hood is that you're getting what biologists might call phylogenies, large branching, diverging phylogenies that look kind of like this. This is a small subphylogeny. There's about 10,000 images on the site, so this is just a small subset. But you see what's happening over time as people branch upon branch upon branch, and that's what's leading to this stuff. So it's coming from branches upon branches. But it's interesting to understand why these discoveries are possible. Because if you really think about it, I mean, these are really impressive discoveries when you think about their humble beginnings, with just some really random blobs. And I want to look at the question of how. How are people discovering these things? Now, actually, there's kind of two camps of thought, and I know this because I've spoken about this so much. One view is sort of like compatible with what I've been saying, which is, yeah, I'm really impressed. Like, explain to me how this is happening. I don't really understand how this could be possible. But there's another view I want to address, which I'm sure some of you hold, which is, now, hold on a second. You're telling me I should be impressed here, but I'm not really sure I should be impressed. Because after all, let's, for example, think about this, like this teapot here. What if I wanted to create a teapot? So this is where we connect into objective. So let's make it an objective, starting with just some blobs, but I want to get a teapot. So I'll make it my objective, and what I'll say is, okay, given it's true that most of the blobs don't look like teapots at the beginning, of course, but I'll choose the one that looks the most like a teapot. And then in the next generation, I'll choose the one that looks the most like a teapot. So basically, I'm measuring my choices against my objective. I'm making incremental improvements measured against the objective. Won't I eventually inevitably get what I want? My objective? So in that sense, why should I be impressed here? Isn't this all just inevitable, what you would expect? And if that were true, then I would agree that this isn't really that interesting. But what's fascinating is that that is not true. It does not work that way. In fact, if you came in with that attitude, you'd almost surely fail. And that's why actually a lot of people find this game pretty frustrating.
Can I try something on you?
Yeah, sure.
Isn't this just incestuous evolution? What you're just saying, from biological...
Dude, just fucking interrupting his talk. I gotta check this out. Oh, can I do it? Oh, yeah. But I want to actually run it. Oh, man. Why is this not easy? You have to log in. Damn. All right.
Point of view, you'd expect it not to go down a projected path. You'd
He's
expect
like,
it to
seriously, dude?
But you're taking a child, breeding it, and then when it matures, you're putting it back in as a parent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually, let me address a little bit the intuitions about why this wouldn't work. It doesn't work. We know this empirically. You can't play it this way. But why not? Well, I mean, think about it. I mean, this is why is any problem hard? The reason problems are hard is because we don't know how to get to the solution, which means, in effect, we don't know what the stepping stones are that lead to that solution. In any complex search space of possibilities, it's always going to be the case that we don't know the intermediate stepping stones that lead to our objective. Because, after all, that's almost by definition, because if we did know the stepping stones, then we just go there. So this is the hard problems, the interesting problems, are always the ones where we don't know what the stepping stones are. And, of course, in a space like this, you can tell just intuitively. I mean, I haven't given you all the under-the-hood, artificial DNA and stuff like that, because I don't have all the time. But you can tell intuitively that this is a complex search space. It's not simple. So it's not like the things that lead to teapots are all just little mini baby teapots. It's going to be something different. And in that sense, you can't get to these places by trying to get to them. So that's pretty puzzling, because when you look at this, then this really leads to a really deep question, which is then how the heck are people getting to these places? Because they're clearly getting there consistently, but I'm telling you, you can't get there by actually trying. So then what is the key to getting to one of these interesting kinds of discoveries? And I'm going to use the story of this car as a kind of an allegory for how this happens in general. And the reason that I can use this story is because I happen to be the guy who discovered the car. So I know exactly what happened along this path. And this was a really kind of important moment for me when I discovered this car, because it was the very strange experience of discovering this car that led me to first start having doubts about the objective approach in Pick Breeder, which led to everything that I'm telling you today in the book that we have. So this, in some ways, strangely enough, evolving this car was kind of an epiphany, or a turning point in my life. So here's the story of the car. And the most important part of the story is just that I wasn't looking for a car. But what I did see was there was this thing that looks like, to me, an alien face. Actually, it looks like E.T., I think. And someone else had evolved that. I never would have evolved it. I don't know how to evolve it, but someone else did, so it was just on the site already. Someone had published it. And I was thinking to myself, as you might think, well, this looks kind of cool, because like if I chose this, I might get all these different aliens. It looks kind of promising in that sense to me, like a good parent for having lots of alien faces. So that's the road I went down. But then something happened, and this is the kind of moment of epiphany, which is that these eyes started to descend over the course of the breeding process. Ever so slightly, they started to descend. And I realized, there was a moment where I just realized, hey, this is starting to look like a car. And when I realized that, I suddenly realized I can get to a car. And that was the moment when it became possible. And then I was able to steer the process, with no pun intended, towards a car. And so then I got a car. And this story is really strange. I want to emphasize how strange it is, because you've got to think about all of the factors that had to come together for me to discover this car. Let me just lay it out for you. First, someone had to do something that I never would have done, because I never would have evolved that alien face. And then second, I had to not be trying to do what I ultimately did. Because after all, if I was looking for a car, I would not have started with this, because that is not a car in my view. So it sounds kind of like, okay, this is a very sort of unusual set of circumstances that might be viewed as a lucky coincidence, even winning the Pick Breeder lottery, I mean, with all these extremely unlikely events kind of coming together to allow this discovery to happen. But here's the amazing thing. This is not a coincidence. It's not an exception. This is the rule. Almost every top image, all the interesting images on the site, has exactly that story. That's always the way that things are found. So, like, in other words, the stepping stones, they almost never resemble the final product. So let me just give you a couple examples here. Like, somebody evolved or bred this thing, and I call this an egg with a hat. That's what I think it looks like. Okay, so it is inconceivable that that person who discovered the egg with a hat said, aha, finally we can get teapots. There's no way that was happening. And similarly, the person who eventually branched from here and got to a teapot, they didn't start out saying, finally there's an egg with a hat, that's just what I've been needing to get my teapot. It's inconceivable that that's happening. Or a dish that led to a skull, or this looks like a letter G that led to Jupiter. It's always the case that the stepping stones don't resemble the final product. So it leads to this really counterintuitive moral, which is you can't find things by not looking. You can only find things by not looking for them. And this is sort of a rule. And so this is an interesting insight about this site, but does it apply outside of Pick Breeder? Is there something special? And of course, I'm going to try to claim to you that this is actually a general insight about creativity and discovery. And it should start to be ringing alarm bells, because we run our society as if this was not true. We are constantly setting objectives. How are we going to get to the skulls and the butterflies of our particular domain of interest if we run our society through objectives?
Can I just give you another poke over here on the left?
Yes.
What you just described is the history of science.
Dude,
people
that
have
is
been
so
wandering around and just discovered
disrespectful.
stuff.
Yes.
And they didn't even construct an experiment to discover what they found. They constructed it to find something else. So there is a very strong corollary.
Shut
here
the
with
fuck
history.
up.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Actually, I was going to connect this to the
Thank you
history of
for
science a
bringing
little bit
that
later.
up.
So that's a very astute observation. In fact, there's several
He's
processes that work
so
like this. Human innovation is one of them, and there's a
respectful.
few others that I'm going to show you. Let me just show you a little more evidence, just to drive the point home. So here's a weird experiment that we did later. We said, okay, we know for a fact that the skull and the butterfly, just as examples, have been discovered. There's no controversy about this. Obviously, somebody discovered these. They exist. So they exist in the space of possibilities, clearly. Not only do they exist in the space of possibilities, but they seem to be relatively easy to find if you look at how much effort went into finding them. There were only 74 selection steps in the history that led to the skull, 90 in the history of the butterfly. So in terms of machine learning or computational search, this is peanuts. I mean, we're talking about millions of iterations in modern algorithms. These are like dozens just to find these. So you might think, well, these can't be that hard to find. They must be sort of like really close by in the search space to any kind of starting position. But actually, so we said, okay, let's see about that. Let's test that. Let's run an algorithm which basically plays Pick Breeder automatically, but always picks the image that's closest to our target or our objective. So we make it into an objective-based search, and we try to rediscover things that were already discovered. This should be easy, right? But it turns out, if you look at these, each one of these images is the result of, and get this, a 30,000 generation attempt to reproduce that image. Remember, these only took a few dozen, but we gave it, big computation because we're in the era of big computation. So we gave it 30,000 generations, and every time it's a miserable failure as an objective. Now, if this was just, some normal machine learning benchmark, you might say, well, the problem is that for some reason this is too hard to discover these things, or the algorithm is not equipped, or something like that. But that can't be the explanation here, because we know these were discovered, and with not very much effort, in fact. The explanation here is that you can't discover these things by looking for them. They can only be discovered by not looking for them. Why would that be? Well, it goes back to this notion of deception. Deception is sort of a notion in search. When people talk about search and optimization, it's a pretty familiar notion. But what this is saying is that this idea of deception is far more pathological than it's often given credit. In other words, what deception means is that you can appear to be going down the wrong path, but you're actually exactly on the road you should be on, or vice versa. You can appear to be way off the road. You can appear to be on the correct road, but you can be running towards a dead end. People know these things as local optima. But it's so severe. I mean, look at this is why we can't get to the skull by trying. Because look, like this crescent was something we would throw away if you said, I want a skull. You say, well, this is not a skull. It's not anything related to a skull. Or this donut. That's not a skull. Every step along the way is deceptive. Now, it's often true that in hindsight we can make a connection. Like we can connect the eyes of the alien face to the wheels of the car. But going forward, there's almost no hope that that kind of very abstract or subtle connection can be made. And so deception is the reason that you can't find things by looking for them. So one thing we did, like in the world of artificial intelligence and machine learning, is we were thinking, these implications are kind of disturbing. Because like even in machine learning, like almost every experiment is run through what's called an objective function. Everything I've been taught was that you set an objective and then you sort of follow a gradient towards that objective. But the world of PictReader works exactly in the opposite way. You have to not be following the gradient of the objective. So we said, what if we actually just started to actually create algorithms that respect this principle, this non-objective principle? And we created an algorithm along those lines called novelty search. So what is going on in PictReader? One interpretation of it is that it's a collector. It's not a finder, it's a collector. Basically, it collects stepping stones. And the reason that that's powerful is because the more stepping stones you have, the more stepping stones you can get to. Now, if your next question is, but where are we trying to go? Then you're missing the point. That is the point. We're not trying to go anywhere in particular. We're just trying to amplify our ability to get everywhere. And so we said, we can make algorithms like this. We don't have to have objectives driving algorithms. So we created an algorithm which basically just says, try to generate completely new behaviors, no objective in mind, and just proliferate all the jumping off points that you can. And there was a succession of interesting results that resulted from this algorithm called novelty search over the last few years, which all sort of showed the same thing, which is that in many domains, I'm not going to say all, but many, it is the case that you will get a better solution and find a solution faster by not trying to solve the problem. In other words, by just trying to generate novelty. And I'm just going to show you one example of this, just for illustration. And this is a biped walking domain. These bipeds were told, we wanted them to be able to walk. In the case on your left, which says fitness best, we will see the best product of traditional objective-based optimization. We said optimize the distance you can walk. And that was sort of given to the learning algorithm and said, come on, try to make the best walker you can. In the case on the right, we said, just generate novel behaviors. And if they're really novel, then explore them further and try to generate more novel behaviors. And what you can see is the best we got from that is far superior to the best we got from trying to optimize the behavior. So this counterintuitive principle raises its head again, but now in a very different domain from the domain of pictures. And that's sort of important because it shows you that this is a general principle. Yeah, and he had a bad night last night too.
Mm-hmm.
So you may say, whenever people see results like this, it's always they're scratching their head first. They say, this is kind of disturbing and counterintuitive, and there's got to be a flaw here. But what you have to remember, and it's always sort of the answer, is the problem is deception. The stepping stones to walking may not look like walking. What are you going to do then? The thing is, like one stepping stone to walking is to learn the principle of oscillation. That's part of walking, right? And so what if you learn to oscillate, but you fall on your face? From an objective optimization standpoint, you've made absolutely zero progress towards maximizing the amount you've walked. And yet it could have been the fundamental discovery that leads to the principle for very robust walking. And this is why objective optimization will not be the best way to generate walking. So the implications seem to us profound. Sort of putting these things together. And I apologize, this sounds like something out of a fortune cookie. The path to success is through not trying to succeed. To achieve our highest goals, we must be willing to abandon them. Or, connecting to collaboration, it is in your interest that others do not follow the path that you think is right, like the person who bred that alien face before me, which I never would have done, because they will lead the stepping stones to your greatest discoveries, like when I discovered the car. And when we're looking at this, we're like, wait a second, this is actually not about computer science. I could tell this to anybody. And this would be a deep conversation. In fact, this is something that dawned on me over years, because initially I was speaking about this a lot, as you can imagine, at AI-related conferences. or computer science conferences, and really in an algorithmic context, I'd be talking about these results. But more and more it dawned on me that people really wanted to talk about this stuff in like a human perspective. They're saying, what does this mean in general, for objective-driven discovery? When you send a proposal over to the National Science Foundation and you say, here's my project and here's my objective, what is that doing to the way that the process of discovery works in general across all of science? The fact that we tend to guard our gates with objectives. You don't have an objective, so how can we give you any funding? I mean, what are you trying to do? It's completely unprincipled. But if it's true that often there are things that we cannot find if we do have an objective, then we're in trouble. So here's some implications for collaboration. Because what it kind of says is that without care, and this reflects some of the things that have been said earlier in this conference, but without care, collaboration can lead to convergence and consensus of a very, very pathological type. Because the problem that happens when you're collaborating with people in a consensus-driven framework, which is like, the way many institutions are run, if you have a panel of experts, you're moving towards consensus. This is true. It's going to prune out the stepping stones. You're going to lose all your diversity. I mean, could you imagine if, when I branched from the alien face, if there were a panel of pick breeder experts, like the luminaries of pick breeder, all got together and said, well, hold on a second, like, is this really justified? You're branching from an alien face here? No, and people need the ability to follow their radical paths to their bitter ends so that we can see where those stepping stones might lead. Otherwise, we get this mediocre washout effect. Compromise for all, but preference of none. And I can show you a great example of that. Coincidentally, and this is really cool that this happened about the same time, this project called the Living Image Project was started at about the same time as Pick Breeder. And it was really nice because it happens to have under the hood like the same mechanics as Pick Breeder. Same kind of genetic encoding, artificial genetic encoding, same kind of search operators, except that instead of a branching operation, the way that it worked was it was based on voting. So it would show you some images just like you see in Pick Breeder, but you would vote. And over like a week, it would collect hundreds of votes from a palette of options. And then it would say, okay, whichever option got the most votes, that will be the parent of the next generation. And after 25,000 votes were cast, an enormous amount of human effort, these are the 9 highest rated images of all time that were generated by the Living Image Project. And you can contrast that with the Pick Breeder. This is probably a lot more effort that was put into this project than Pick Breeder, and yet look at how much more stunted these results are. This is the result of convergent consensus, and it's just so stark. It's nice to show this through images because it makes it so explicit. We can talk about it in the abstract, but here it is in front of you. Is this the world that you want to create or live in? And this is the world that this is just again to reiterate this point. This is how science is basically driven. We base science funding decisions on convergent consensus. What is it doing? What would the world look like if we were doing things this way?
So on your left here, back left.
Yeah.
This is really exciting, and I'm shocked also. But there's a meta point here which I find also interesting, and maybe you might want to comment on. Maybe a meta point that might be right or might be not. You didn't set out to discover this.
No.
Right.
No, we did not.
So the meta point is that this was discovered by not setting out to discover it.
That is a great point. I mean, actually, to actually elaborate on that a little bit, just to make it even more ironic, I actually proposed Pick Breeder to the National Science Foundation before we'd made it, and it was severely rejected. And the explanation from the summary of the panel's feelings was that it's entirely unclear what your objective is here. It's not clear what you're trying to accomplish. They said nothing good will come of this. And again, this happened before any of this theory. So
the trouble is, NSF is peer-reviewed. It's a group. It's consensus.
Yes, it's
exactly
convergent consensus. Yes, I mean, this is my revenge.
Right. Immediately next to Lynn.
Yeah.
So if I were to think about this mathematically, I might think that if I were in the area of the local maximum that I'm interested in, I want to use the gradient method. But if I'm anywhere farther away from it, there are going to be lots of local maxima, and I'm going to approach the maximum I want only by using a genetic algorithm, right? The gradient approach won't get me there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the spirit of that is correct. I would agree, except that it's not that it's a genetic algorithm. I mean, because a genetic algorithm can be run objectively, and in fact, in the world of genetic algorithms, even they are usually objectively driven. Like you give it something we call a fitness function, and then that is basically a measure of how far you are from your objective, and that's the score we give an individual. So there's like really, before novelty search, there's very few search techniques that existed that sort of captured the spirit of this intuition. But in reality, we can sort of apply this intuition to almost any technique, including a genetic algorithm, because we can just reward something other than objective performance, like novelty. Or like in Pick Breeder, I'd argue what's being rewarded is what we call interestingness, but that's very hard to formalize. I just wanted to highlight here that one of the lessons here is how essential it is to protect individual autonomy in creative endeavors. I'm obviously not saying that this applies to everything. Like, I'd be a kook if I got up here and told you drop all your objectives. No objectives anymore in corporate America. That would be crazy. But when you're trying to foster innovation, it's in those pockets where this becomes a really dangerous problem. And in those places, this shows you very starkly why it's so important to protect individual autonomy. Because the reason we're getting to these places is because people, once they branch, are completely isolated from everyone else. No one can interfere with me while I'm on my branch. I go wherever that may lead me. And that's why we get to see all of these radical stepping stones accumulating. If we didn't do that, we live in a world like this.
Before you move on, Ken,
yeah.
you have a question up front.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, what do you think Edison would have said?
What would Edison have said? Could you tell me why, or
He's
some
kind
context?
of a purposeful, objective guy. You know, I can see you right now because of him.
Yeah, yeah.
So
yeah. So I think, you know, there are a lot of people who have set out and done something amazing. I mean, Edison's an example, who you may think are counterexamples, or maybe they even somewhat, you know, relieve the anxiety I'm giving you. And say, this guy's exaggerating how bad the situation is here, because look at all these achievers. But my interpretation of those things is that what's actually happening is that these visionaries are people who realize that the stepping stones have been laid. It's not that they see several stepping stones into the future like some you know, omnipotent visionary and can see the path. It's that they realize that we're just one stepping stone away because of things that were done by their predecessors. So, you know, things like...
I would add that likely a lot of these iterations that they're showing are not... They're not the first time in the iterations that butterfly appeared. Like, there were probably several butterflies leading up to the final butterfly that they saved and submitted. And in that instance, they said, wow, it's a butterfly, and kept choosing more butterfly-like images. And so there comes a point, essentially, in the process of discovery when we realize we're onto something. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be a butterfly in the pick breeder, or it could be a car, because, I mean, at some point he realized he was on to creating a car, whether or not that was the first car image that looked like a car. And he said that the eyes descended slowly so that over time it looked more like wheels. That implies that there's a time when it looked like a car, but it wasn't the final image that he selected. And so he recognized the car prior to the actual final image. And so it, in a way, it became an objective, but it was one that was foreseeable, that they could actually realize because they were close enough. But when we look too far away, then essentially chaos reigns because we can't account for all the variables. But on a small frame, when there's only a much smaller amount of variables, then it's like predicting the weather 10 seconds in the future. I can predict that the weather is going to be essentially identical to what it is right now 10 seconds from now, because that's how it is. But let's say 10 hours from now, unless I look up some weather report, and even then that may not be right. 10 days from now, 10 weeks from now, the further off we go, the more it becomes just chaos. And chaos theory, it's called, which is basically that the present determines the future, but the approximate present does not determine the approximate future. But if we have a approximate present that's close enough to the actual present, then it becomes much more likely for the approximate future to be close to the actual future. And so in the case of a car, for instance, the approximate present is that it's a car, and the approximate future would be that it's a car, and that plays out as predicted, and as the objective would have been, because that's what he tended to pick towards once it became close enough to in appearance that he actually selected the ones intentionally that brought it to more towards a car or butterfly or a skull or whatever it may be. I'd be curious to see the iterations of this process before, like leading up to see how similar they are to the final product, and how far back it goes to actually have an image that doesn't look like the final product. let's say 10 images, for example, is 10 images back far enough in the list where they no longer resemble the final product, and you couldn't say at that point that you wanted that final product to be the final product, or 5 or 3? Like, is there some number that they all have, let's say, or percentage? Anyway, let me go back a little.
Visionary and can see the path. It's that they realize that we're just one stepping stone away because of things that were done by their predecessors. So, things like it took vacuum tubes to build the first computer, but the people who were designing vacuum tubes were not thinking about computers. If you had told those people that they need to work on making a computer, like go back, to the 1800s and say, you're wasting time with vacuum tubes, build a computer, this is a much cooler idea, we would have no vacuum tubes and no computers because they were working on the very stepping stone that we needed. But there was a time where the vacuum tubes were available and the stepping stones had been created. And so that created that possibility, and someone was standing on that stepping stone at that time and realized it's just a little bit of a step from there to computation. And so I think the issue is that somebody like Edison is looking at what has been created in the immediate past and seeing that possibility has been created that's just a stepping stone away that we didn't realize before.
All of a sudden, we've got a bunch of questions, so let's try to get through them all. Mark.
Okay.
So that was a just breathtakingly brilliant presentation. Thank you. And it actually correlates enormously with my own personal.
Is he done? Like, that implies it's done. I'm not sure that he was actually done. Oh, this is weird. I'm really intrigued to watch more of it from this guy.
Brilliant presentation. Thank you. And it actually correlates enormously with my own personal experience. I was asked to set up an innovation center at a big healthcare system, and the person, our CEO, set it up, had the wisdom to say, if I know what this is going to be, it's not going to be very innovative. And that the 3 most important things that we've accomplished in the last 3-4 years have none of them were planned, and all of them just happened actually because of personal relationships. And and the other observation you think about, look at the interesting images you got on 74 steps as opposed to 26,000 steps. It sort of validates the principle that all great ideas are simple.
Not steps, votes. He's missing that's not steps. It's votes, meaning that they're basically perspectives that counteract one another, and so ultimately it achieves nothing, or what it achieves is not nearly as unique.
And it's really just terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a million examples like this, and I hate to say something so cliche, but if you read the book, you can find like a lot of them. We collected tons of them, like these kind of serendipitous discoveries, which happen to be more the rule than the exception when it's really something exciting.
Okay, we will get to all the folks who have their hands raised. There's a couple
okay.
Tim.
Here on your left.
Okay.
So, awesome talk. I love the idea. But my question is, how do you identify a stepping stone? What is a stepping stone for you? How do you quantify that? And all those people now who like to implement that in their firms, how do we know what's a stepping stone?
In their objectives.
Let me say a couple things about that. A stepping stone is something that can lead somewhere interesting. So it's something that creates potential. And I think that we have become afraid to acknowledge that those with expertise have the ability to identify things that are interesting. The way we think about it is that we need to subject you to some kind of accountability and assessment to make sure that you're not wrong if we go down this path. So we need some kind of objective metric to say, are you moving in the right direction? But the problem is that the stepping stones are the things that we recognize not because they are objectively superior, but because they have some kind of intrinsic potential. And that intrinsic potential is very difficult to formalize, but we see that humans are particularly good at identifying it. So in PickBreeder, the people who are finding the interesting images are playing exactly that game. They see something that they think is interesting, like the egg with the hat, and they publish that because they think it has potential, it's interesting, it's going to lead to other interesting things. We can't exactly say where it's going to lead. And we can see this across, I think, many domains where experts often have these kinds of intuitions. Novelty search, which is this algorithm we created to try to capture this idea, it just says novelty is the proxy. So novelty is like a proxy for interestingness. Mm-hmm. If you can generate something that's genuinely novel, then that probably will lead to more things that are novel as a stepping stone. But it's not the be-all and end-all of what identifies a good stepping stone. What identifies a good stepping stone is ultimately something subjective, and that's why we have so much discomfort with it, and that's why we tend to align our institutions away from that, because we don't like subjectivity. But we're going to have to accept subjectivity if we're going to embrace this principle, or the objective paradox.
Okay, Eric?
Wonderful talk, Ken. A couple of maybe the questions and observations. I have always wondered why it is that the most creative artists seem to be the most mentally deranged. And you may have helped illuminate that.
Right.
Also, an observation that meshes with comments that were made earlier about science. The most profound discoveries in science are often made by outsiders. The fellow who came up with the
I just want to pause. He says mentally deranged. I mean, it's all a matter of perspective, you know. Whether someone's insane or sane, I mean, that's according to some textbook, which, you know, is based on people who don't necessarily understand human nature. They're drawing conclusions about people, saying, like, you are this thing, like, say, bipolar or narcissistic or, you know, whatever it may be. When in reality, no one is that thing. You know, that's just a matter of perspective. And when we actually say that someone is that thing, we're giving it some kind of weight. The name that we're assigning to that person, say, oh, they have attention deficit disorder, so we should then prescribe some drugs. That's what we need to do, is give them some drugs that'll help their attention deficit disorder. Maybe it's just them knowing something that not perceiving value in something that isn't as valuable as them doing whatever it is that they're doing, you know. Like, there's all sorts of reasons for why people aren't paying attention in a certain circumstance, and to assign some label like, oh, attention deficit disorder, the reason this child is not paying attention in class is because they have ADD. Nothing to do with the shitty teacher who doesn't actually in any way draw people in to listen, blah, 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 shitty subject, lies, you know, just the structure of the system, the way we do things, nothing to do with anything. It's just literally that child has ADD and needs to take prescription drugs. And never mind that they're a child and we're fucking giving them drugs. Here, child, take some drugs. Take some drugs, child. Anyway, sorry. He said deranged. As soon as someone assigns some, like, label to someone like that, it's just something in my brain says, whoa. Back up. Let's talk about this.
So an observation that meshes with comments that were made earlier about science. The most profound discoveries in science are often made by outsiders. The fellow who came up with the tectonic theory of the way geology works was a complete outsider. He was an amateur and was roundly derided by the experts. But he was able to, well, perhaps step on stepping stones and build to the next stage in a way that the experts couldn't. Finally, moving perhaps a little more darkly, I've always wondered why committees are so awful. And I think you've illuminated why here.
I'm sorry, I can't see your badge.
You just fucking talk to dudes like Greg.
You know who I'm pointing to.
Yeah. Was there any structure at all to when people were posting their results of their branching? Was there any structure to that, or did everything just kind of filter into the same bulk database that just got randomized on?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Like the real mechanics of how that site is working. Actually, the site is arranged to make it easy for you to kind of browse through different images that have been published. So it's not just some giant bulk thing with thousands of images. Like there's a rating system, so you can give them stars, so you can get the top ranked ones. It ranks them by most branched, so you can have a different view where you can see what do people prefer to branch from. There's like random, where you can just get something random, or you can even search by a keyword, because people are allowed to label them. So I could say enter face into PickReader and get all the faces that have ever been bred. So there's a lot of ways to give people access. And I think that what that also shows is that a successful innovative enterprise needs to give people really good access to all the potential stepping stones. That's kind of a lesson from this. It's like we tend to be very narrow about exposing people to stepping stones. Like if you expose your proposal to a very small panel of scientists or experts, then only they know about this potential stepping stone. But if there's one person out of 1,000 for whom that is the key to their whole life, they're never going to find out about it because they're not exposed. And so somehow, what PickReader shows is that there's a lot of value in exposing widely all of the ideas that are out there to as many people as possible, because you just need that one magic connection to go to the next stepping stone.
Okay, I'm going to let Steve ask the
right.
It's just really more of an observation, just that we've seen we have two examples of this right here at this meeting, right? Started out doing one thing and stumbled upon something else that didn't fully succeed, but it was the thing worth pursuing. Slack famously started out as a game, and they built a tool, and the tool was Slack.
Right, great example, yeah.
Right.
Can I conclude? Or say
I was just going to say, we've enjoyed your talk too much. So much that I will give you a couple minutes to wrap it up.
Okay, I need to think because I didn't get very far. But let me see. I think
we didn't really have an objective anyway.
Yeah, so... okay, let me make this point.
Wow.
We see this kind of phenomenon in several processes. I mean, pick, read, or novelty search are artificial, but they have no final objective. In other words, in aggregate, the people on pick, reader, they're not searching for some ultimate image. That's why it works. Novelty search isn't searching for some ultimate objective, and that's why it works. Natural evolution, there's no uber organism that the whole process was set out to finally discover. It's not us. That's why natural evolution is discovering all this stuff. If we were the objective, we wouldn't be here. Human innovation, which was raised earlier, like science, doesn't have some uber invention that all of us are walking lockstep towards as we converge in. These are the processes that are most prolifically creative that are known to humankind. And we should be modeling our innovative endeavors more closely with the way that they actually work, which is that they are not objectively driven. These are stepping stone collectors, which means that they're not solutions to particular problems. They're accumulators of potential. The more potential they accumulate, the more potential they can accumulate. And it's that divergence that you see intrinsic in that kind of process that makes it so creative. Let me just say, here's a quote. So from a Chinese philosopher, he said, probably better than I could, a good traveler has no fixed plans and is not intent on arriving. And just lastly, I just want to say that, I know this is the end, and unfortunately I'm leaving. I can stick around until about 5 p.m., so I'll just hang around a little bit. But because of that, I have little opportunity to talk to you guys, and but I'd be more than happy to hear any feedback, positive or negative. So please feel more than free to email me at my email address here, and if you want to talk further. Thank you.
That was phenomenal. No, I'm so glad I watched that. Sucks how much the audience just disrespected. I've never seen that in a talk. Just like, oh, I'm just gonna ask a question. Don't mind me. Don't actually give me any affirmation to do this. I'm just gonna go ahead and blah. Oh, that person did the blah, so maybe I should do the blah. Shit, he's like, yeah, I didn't actually get through like anything. I know this is all really interesting, but I didn't really get through everything. So yeah, so that was cool. Bravo, great research. I agree. That's really important to be aware of, conscious of. I would say, I would add perhaps that when we have objectives, it's like moving in a direction, and if you basically move a field, like a magnetic field, in that direction, then it can create repulsion of anything, of the objective, in a way where it pushes away. So you're just chasing this objective while pushing it away, and therefore never reaching it. Why exactly the poles would be in opposite directions to have that outcome, I'm sure there's some reason that I'm not coming up with it off the top of my head, because that would ultimately be what would happen if the poles were in the same direction, so north and north. Then as you move towards the objective, then it would cause attraction, and so you would reach it in essence. But because we're not reaching the objective, we're ultimately pushing that objective away. And there's a reason for that in terms of magnetic fields, because that's how the universe functions. Anyway, that was really interesting. I'm going to conclude this. Thanks for watching. If you're still if you stuck around through this all, hearing me out, hearing Kenneth Stanley out, this was really fascinating. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back whenever. Later.